I'm David Adams, Todd's brother-in-law, Barbara's brother. And I'd like to say that Todd is a kind, caring man who I have never seen behave poorly or in a controlling manner toward anyone.
On September 16th, 2016, Todd Kendhammer called 911 from the side of a rural Wisconsin road. His wife Barbara was badly injured, and Todd had an explanation that sounded almost impossible. He said a piece of metal pipe had come off another vehicle, hit the pavement, and blasted through his windshield. Barbara would die from her injuries. Todd would eventually be convicted of murdering her. Police believed this wasn't a freak accident at all. They believed Todd had created the scene himself, and looking at the evidence, it's not difficult to understand why. The truck Todd described couldn't be found. The reason for being on that road began falling apart. Barbara's injuries raised disturbing questions, and experts looked at the windshield and saw signs that Todd's story didn't make sense. But there's one thing I haven't told you. Before Todd was convicted, investigators actually tried dropping pipes from moving trucks to see whether his supposedly impossible accident could happen. They tried it 9 times, and one of those tests would eventually become one of the strangest pieces of evidence in this entire case. Todd and Barbara Kendhammer had been married for 25 years. They had children. They had recently become grandparents, and their children would later insist that the relationship they grew up watching was loving. There was no simple, obvious motive that made Barbara's death immediately make sense. No obvious affair. No dramatic escape plan. No long public history of violence between them. But there was one detail about Todd that investigators would eventually find interesting. Todd made extra money replacing windshields. Remember that, because eventually, this entire case comes down to one piece of glass. Friday, September 16th. Barbara was supposed to work that morning. Todd was driving. Barbara was in the passenger seat, but instead of simply heading toward Barbara's workplace, the Kendhammers were traveling in a direction investigators would later struggle to explain.
Okay, so you're traveling from here to this direction. Okay. Can you, sometimes looking at pictures help you? I know you're out there to see, but there's also looking at a still picture might help.
It was right driveway, just after this, right by or right after this driveway.
Okay. And that's where the pipe came through the windshield. That's when you...
Todd said there was a reason. Before Barbara went to work, he needed to make a quick detour involving a windshield job. Nothing sinister about that, except police would eventually check the story, and what they found would change the entire investigation. But first, Todd said something happened on County Highway M that no one could have predicted. Todd said he saw something coming toward the car. At first, he thought it was a bird.
I thought it was a bird. I thought it was a pipe.
Then he realized it was a pipe.
I didn't think a pipe could fly.
And after it came through the windshield, did you know what it was?
I did not immediately.
Todd said there was barely time to react. He lunged forward.
When you saw what you thought was a bird, what did you do?
I lunged forward.
The pipe came through the passenger side of the windshield. Barbara began moving violently. Todd said he pulled off the road, eventually ending up in a ditch farther ahead. He got out, went around to Barbara, removed the pipe, tried to get her out, and attempted to save her. Then he called 911. Standing there beside a shattered windshield and a badly injured wife, Todd had given police a very specific story, which meant investigators could start testing it. And the first question was simple. Where was the truck? Todd said the pipe came from an older flatbed-style truck traveling toward him.
He said the truck was going this way. It was an older flatbed. It came off the flatbed truck and went right through the windshield. He said he tried to deflect it, but he couldn't, and it hit her in the head, and she just started flailing all over.
So police looked for it. They checked the area. They reviewed available surveillance. They tried to identify a truck matching Todd's description.
Deputy Amundsen, who that day was trying to get as much video as he could before it was destroyed to see what he could see. If there was a flatbed truck, or a truck with pipes, or a scrap truck. Captain Zimmerman went out to Wild Wings and found video there. They went up and down the highway looking for video.
Police never identified the truck Todd described. They reviewed the available surveillance again and again, but the footage was too poor to determine whether some of the vehicles it captured were flatbed trucks.
Tell the jury what you were able to see with any degree of certainty.
I couldn't tell you with any degree of certainty what each vehicle was. I can tell you I viewed vehicles going northbound and southbound. I could tell some vehicles are larger, or some looked like a car, or a bigger vehicle, which you would assume was a truck. But I couldn't tell you what each of those trucks were, or if it was a flatbed or not a flatbed, or what kind of bed the truck had.
One sequence even showed a southbound vehicle about 10 seconds after a possible Kendhammer vehicle, but investigators couldn't determine what kind of vehicle it was. Now that doesn't prove absolutely that no truck existed, but imagine the problem from an investigator's perspective. A truck supposedly loses a large piece of metal on a public road. That pipe crashes through another vehicle. A woman is fatally injured, and yet nobody can identify the truck. No driver comes forward. No matching vehicle appears in the footage police reviewed. That was the first thing investigators couldn't make fit. The second thing was much harder for Todd to explain. Remember Todd's explanation for why he and Barbara were traveling in that direction. The windshield job. Police asked who the job was for. Todd gave them a name. Investigators checked. The person Todd identified wasn't expecting him. There was no windshield job waiting. Now investigators had a serious problem, because Todd hadn't merely forgotten some meaningless detail. This was his explanation for why he and Barbara were on that road in the first place. Police pressed him. Todd gave another explanation involving someone else. Investigators checked that one too. Same problem. That person wasn't waiting for Todd to arrive and replace a windshield either. But by this point, investigators were already moving away from the idea of a freak accident. They were starting to think Todd was lying, and they told him.
I'm saying that Justin is saying that there wasn't a windshield order. He didn't talk to you and seen you in about a month.
And so I told you, at least a month, maybe, I'm just guessing a month, but I'm not changing my story. I'm 100%.
I'm not saying you are.
I'm 100%.
Todd was brought in for questioning. At first, investigators let him talk about the accident. Then the tone changed.
I honestly wish I could explain this to you.
Because your story about going to pick up a vehicle to do the windshield that's a lie.
It's not a lie.
That's a complete lie.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
They challenged his explanation for being on the road. They challenged his timeline. They challenged the details. And then the questioning moved from what happened to something much more direct.
I've
Why
never,
would you say that? Why? I mean,
because I've never, ever, in 28 years, never touched her or grabbed her or raised my voice with her.
Todd insisted he had not hurt Barbara, but police had already photographed Todd himself.
You want him to take pictures of Todd, his hands and everything before he takes off?
yes.
Okay.
There were injuries on his hands. There were scratches and marks investigators examined. Todd had explanations for them. Prosecutors would later argue there was another explanation. A struggle, and if that was true, Barbara's body should contain evidence of it. So investigators turned to the medical examiner. The medical evidence is complicated, but the important part is this. The state's forensic pathologist did not believe Barbara's injuries were neatly explained by one random pipe impact.
I have seen injuries related to people having seizures. I have never seen this multitude of injuries and the severity of injuries.
She had suffered severe blunt impact injuries involving her head and neck, and there were multiple injuries that prosecutors believed fit a physical assault better than Todd's accident story. Some findings also raised questions about possible defensive injury and trauma to Barbara's neck.
Is it possible that those abrasions were caused by shards of glass?
I don't believe those abrasions were caused by shards of glass hitting her neck. No, I feel that is inconsistent.
But if she had shards of glass on her neck, and she had to be wrested out of the car against her husband, who might have been holding her in a bear hug, and they fell backwards, that had the potential to press those shards of glass into the flesh. Is that correct?
It would have that potential.
For prosecutors, this was devastating. The strange route could be explained away. The missing truck might theoretically never be found. But if Barbara's injuries didn't match the accident, Todd had a much bigger problem. The defense disagreed.
When Dr. McCubbin concluded her autopsy, she said that a single impact from a pipe cannot account for the multitude of injuries. doesn't mean there was foul play, and it doesn't mean that the accused has to prove his innocence.
They argued that a violent accident, movement inside the vehicle, efforts to remove Barbara, and emergency medical treatment could complicate the injury pattern. Years later, another forensic pathologist would offer an interpretation much more favorable to Todd. But at trial, there was another piece of evidence that seemed capable of settling the argument. The windshield, because if Todd was lying, the glass itself should show it. If you want to see more cases like this one, please subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thanks a lot. Now back to the video. Look at this windshield. This is where the case becomes especially interesting. Everyone agrees the windshield was damaged. Everyone agrees the pipe was involved somehow. The question is, in what order did everything happen? The defense called glass expert Mark Meshulam. He studied the fracture patterns, and he believed he could identify separate events in the glass.
Well, this is fracture number 1, where Mr. Kendhammer's hand punched in from beneath this. This is the exterior face of the glass.
The defense's sequence looked something like this. First, Todd's hand strikes the windshield as he reacts. Second, the pipe penetrates the glass. And third, additional damage occurs as the pipe is moved or removed.
This crack came first, and then this activity took place afterward, but this one occurred first, and then that one occurred after it through the prying action.
And the line that we're talking about would have ended where impact number 3 just happened to happen moments later? Is that your testimony?
I'm not sure that it actually ends up at that spot.
If Meshulam was right, the windshield could support important parts of Todd's account. Then the state looked at the exact same windshield and saw something very different. Prosecutors argued that the glass showed external impacts that didn't fit a single flying pipe entering the car the way Todd described.
In a third of a second, tenth of a second, where you see a bird turn into a pipe and beat that pipe to the windshield. Not possible, defies physics.
Their story was that the scene had been created. And remember that detail from the beginning. Todd knew windshields. Same windshield, same cracks, same pipe. 2 completely different stories. So which one was right? For that, the jury eventually had to decide who they believed. Todd did something risky. He testified. He told the jury the same basic story. The pipe came toward the vehicle, entered the windshield, and Barbara was injured in a freak accident. But cross-examination brought investigators' earlier problems back into the courtroom. The missing truck, the reason Todd and Barbara were on County M.
Why she wouldn't have been to work on time that day. It's objectively not true that she could come in late. The employees didn't testify that you could flex your time or come in whenever. She always called. They expected her. She knew she had to be there. So why was she driving north?
The windshield job, the people who weren't expecting him, and the changing details.
Where was he going that morning? He first told police that he was going to see Justin Heim. When he was told that's not possible, it changed to a friend, Ben Paff. When that wasn't possible at trial, for the first time, he came up with Jared logging, and that's not possible.
Todd kept insisting the central fact had never changed. He had not murdered Barbara. A pipe had come through the windshield. Now the jury had heard both versions, and by the time prosecutors stood up for closing arguments, they weren't describing this as an accident anymore. The state's theory was straightforward. Barbara's injuries came from an attack. Todd's injuries came from the same confrontation. And the pipe and windshield were part of an attempt to disguise what really happened.
This was a fight. Barbara's not a woman that would walk around after breaking a nail at work and just leave it that way. It was broken during this struggle.
To prosecutors, the pieces now fit. The unexplained route, the windshield job story investigators couldn't verify, the missing truck, Todd's injuries, Barbara's injuries, the glass, and Todd's changing explanations.
There's a lot of blows that you can land in 3 minutes, even 1 minute. A blow per second is a lot of blows. Why would he wait 5 minutes before calling 911?
Now, it's the state's theory. If you look at this, the first 911 call is at 8:05 and 23 seconds, and that's by the 911 clock. So what does that give him? 2 minutes to think of all of that and do all of that, and that's absurd.
The defense said investigators had taken an extraordinary accident and forced every uncertainty into a murder theory.
It involved pathology, it involves medicine, and specifically trauma medicine, it involves biomechanics, it involves glass, it involves DNA, it involves blood. and the state never approached it that way. The state approached it with tunnel vision. Nobody who knew Barb and Todd ever saw them argue. Not in 25 years of marriage or during their entire courtship. There might be a day when no marriage was perfect. Doesn't mean you're going to kill your spouse.
How would you describe to the jury the relationship between your mother and your father from your perspective?
Absolutely perfect. I tried to model my marriage after theirs.
And that's what I'm asking you to do. By weighing evidence, by using common sense, and by demanding proof, and not taking the state's invitation to fill the blanks in with guilt. Find Todd Kendhammer not guilty.
Any old person who was there has told lie after lie after lie. And the only reason he would lie is because he's done something wrong. So as Mr. Hurley said, I also urge you to use your common sense. When people tell you stories, how do you know they're not true? When people lie to you, do they usually have a reason to lie? And we've proven to you that Mr. Kendhammer killed his wife and then tried to cover it up and then came into court and lied to you to try to get away with it.
Then the jury left the courtroom. After a 9-day trial, the jury deliberated for roughly 10 hours. Then came the verdict.
Mr. Kendhammer, if you'd please rise for the reading of the verdict. State of Wisconsin versus Todd A. Kendhammer, 16 CF 909. We, the jury, find the defendant Todd A. Kendhammer guilty.
Todd Kendhammer was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide. He was sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for release after 30 years. And if the story ended here, it would be fairly simple. Todd gave police an unbelievable explanation. Investigators found contradictions. Experts challenged his account. A jury rejected it.
You are the one responsible for her death. That's some pipe falling off a truck.
Case closed. Except the jury had never seen what happened when investigators actually tried dropping the pipe. Before the trial, investigators had performed pipe drop experiments. They used trucks, they changed the height, they changed the speed, they dropped a similar pipe onto the same road. They wanted to answer one simple question. Could a pipe behave anything like the object Todd described? There were 9 tests. Test 1, the pipe drops. It doesn't produce the trajectory Todd needs. Test 2 again, no. Test 3, no. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 of the 9 tests did not produce the kind of bounce that could send a pipe toward the passenger side of an oncoming vehicle the way Todd's account required. That's powerful evidence against him. Investigators tried again and again, and Todd's bizarre accident wasn't being recreated. If you're already convinced he's guilty, this is probably where you'll think the argument ends. It doesn't. There was 1 test left. In one of the 9 experiments, the pipe hit the road, bounced, and twisted. Later, a reconstruction expert working with Todd's post-conviction team studied that test, and he said the pipe's movement came surprisingly close to the kind of passenger-side windshield trajectory Todd had described. Not perfectly, not conclusively, and certainly not enough to prove what happened to Barbara, but close enough that suddenly, one part of Todd's supposedly impossible story wasn't quite so easy to dismiss. A falling pipe could bounce, it could rotate, and at least once, something occurred that resembled a critical part of Todd's version. Now we have a completely different question. Does one unusual result show that Todd's story was physically possible, or do 8 failures show just how extraordinarily unlikely it was? And there's another important detail. The original jury never saw those tests. This part is important. The pipe tests were not secret evidence the prosecutors hid from Todd. Both sides knew about them. Todd's original defense lawyers agreed not to use them, and their concern isn't difficult to understand. There were too many unknown variables. Nobody knew exactly what kind of truck Todd had supposedly seen, its exact height, its exact speed, the original position of the pipe, or exactly how the pipe had fallen. And most importantly, 8 of the 9 experiments could have been extremely useful to prosecutors. Imagine the closing argument. We tried his story 9 times. 8 times it didn't happen. Todd's later lawyers argued that the one unusual test mattered enough that the jury should have seen it. But the courts ultimately concluded that his original defense team's decision was a reasonable strategic choice. So this isn't a story about evidence being buried. It's something more interesting. The evidence cuts both ways. And the pipe wasn't the only issue raised later. Witnesses testified that commercial vehicles carrying metal pipes and scrap did use County Highway M. Well drillers described pipe like the type involved in this case being transported by businesses in the area. And at Todd's original trial, the defense had already presented testimony that another pipe had been seen lying near the road weeks later. That doesn't identify Todd's mysterious truck. It doesn't prove one passed him that morning, and it doesn't erase the surveillance problem.
But I couldn't tell you what each of those trucks were, or if it was a flatbed or not a flatbed, or what kind of bed the truck had.
But it does make one part of his story less fantastical. Pipe being transported on that road was not unheard of. And then, the medical evidence became less clear-cut too. During Todd's later post-conviction case, a different forensic pathologist reviewed Barbara's injuries. Her interpretation was much more favorable to the defense. She did not believe the evidence showed Barbara had been beaten or strangled.
Did you observe anything on her body that was consistent with Barbara Kendhammer having been beaten with fists?
No.
Or that she was a woman who had been in a fight?
No.
And she concluded that the fatal injuries were consistent with a vehicle accident.
Barbara Kendhammer died as a result of an automobile accident.
That doesn't erase the original medical examiner's conclusions. It means two qualified experts looked at the same injuries and disagreed about what they meant, which is starting to sound familiar. The windshield experts disagreed. The medical experts disagreed. The pipe experiments produced 8 results pointing one way, and one strange result pointing another way. But disagreement isn't the same as overturning a murder conviction. Todd still had to convince the courts that something had gone legally wrong at his trial. So far, he hasn't. Todd's later lawyers argued that his original defense had failed him. They pointed to the pipe tests, additional witnesses, new expert testimony, and other evidence they believed the jury should have heard. In 2024, the Wisconsin Court of Appeals rejected those arguments. The court concluded that Todd's trial lawyers had made reasonable strategic decisions. The Wisconsin Supreme Court declined further review, and in February of 2025, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear Todd's case. The conviction remained intact. Todd continued fighting. In 2025, he filed a federal habeas corpus petition challenging his conviction. The case moved beyond its earliest procedural stage, and attorneys were appointed to represent him. That does not mean a court believes Todd is innocent. It doesn't mean he's getting a new trial, and it certainly doesn't erase the jury's verdict. As things stand, Todd Kendhammer remains convicted of murdering Barbara. Now look at the windshield again. At the beginning of this story, it was just broken glass. Now you know why every crack mattered. You know why the pipe mattered, why Todd's injuries mattered, why the route mattered, and why one question has followed this case for years. But if you're asking only whether the physical event Todd described was absolutely impossible, the evidence leaves a frustrating answer. And that leaves the question at the heart of this case. Was that one unusual test evidence that a freak accident really could have happened? Or were the other 8 failures showing us exactly why the jury didn't believe Todd Kendhammer?
I'm David Adams, Todd's brother-in-law, Barbara's brother. And I'd like to say that Todd is a kind, caring man who I have never seen behave poorly or in a controlling manner toward anyone.